Greetings from Vienna, Austria, and welcome to our April MOOC on Tricentis Tosca best practices. I am Trang Le, training consultant, and with me is Christian Meyer, our managing consultant. Christian has been with the company for 10 years and he focuses on rollout and enterprise implementation, therefore a great person to talk about best practices in Tosca. Some of you who join our MOOCs on a regular basis will have heard this many times. But since there are some people joining us for the first time, please allow me to talk about our housekeeping rules. All participants must be muted during the session. As there are hundreds of you currently attending, obviously everyone talking would be confusing and hard to follow. There is a control panel at the bottom of your screen with apps you can toggle on or off. Key ones being Q&A, Twitter, Share, and the media player. Please note, if you pause the media player, we will disappear, so don't do that. Even though you're all muted, we do encourage you to ask questions during the session. Please use the before-mentioned Q&A box. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the MOOC. Therefore, we will hold the most interesting questions for the Q&A session, so that everyone can profit from the answers. We will, however, answer as many questions as possible during the session. But please be aware that only questions related to the current topics will be covered. Please keep in mind that, given the number of attendees, we might not be able to answer all of your questions during the session. Lastly, let me state that this session will be recorded and will be shared on our website later this week. And now, here's Christian Meyer.
Okay, let's dive into the best practices in Tosca, or at least some of them. So first, I will quickly talk about why we think best practices are helpful and a must-have when you're using Tosca. Then I will show you our most wanted 10 best practices for today, all around automation, and then we will have time for some Q&A. Okay, why do we need best practices in Tosca, or in my opinion, in any other tool? Different software usually uses different ways or gives you different ways of reaching the same goal. Some are more effort, some are less effort, but in the end you have the same. So this is why we define best practices. So you have different options in an application, but we want to see the quickest ways of reaching certain goals or the most maintainable ways of using a software, right? Especially a huge software as the Tosca test suite is, with its different components and different possibilities all around automation and test management. If you use a software outside of those best practices, then maintenance time will be increased a lot, and you will have more time spent for the same outcome. Here's a quick example. From the Office suite, you could use Excel, that everybody knows, for creating formatted text, right? It works. You can see here you have different chapters, you have a header, which basically looks as formatting as in any Word document. But it's much harder to reach the same goal than if you would simply use Word for that, right? In Word, you have support for formatting, you have much more space, and you have quick sections, navigation, and all that stuff that Word is famous for formatting text. Stuff that you would never be able to do with Excel out of the box. So for Tosca, there's also a lot of different ways of doing things, and also a lot of ways of doing things wrong. So if you adhere to certain best practices in Tosca, you will reduce the maintenance effort drastically. The artifacts that you create will be more readable for everyone, even for beginners or business users that just want to see reports out of your system. The team will much more easily work together. Everyone is using the same rules. Everyone uses the same object types or principles. to navigate in the software. The automation will be much more stable if you're using certain best practices or principles that we would recommend you to use. The communication with our support team will be much easier because the support team speaks the same language and is familiar to the artifacts and the ways you're using Tosca. The execution time will be increased a lot if you're not doing certain things that will slow down the execution, and also the creation of your execution artifacts or the execution list will be much faster when you use certain best practices. Unattended execution, something very important for DevOps today or continuous integration, will be much more stable if you're using certain best practices. And the general test case quality will be increased a lot. And last but not least in this list, the tool will be much more fun to use and easier to use for you if you're doing certain things the way we would recommend you to use them. This is just a short list. There is a much more reasons for using best practices or certain processes in Tosca. Okay, for today, I will show you the top 10, in my opinion, of best practices around automation with Tosca. All the best practices are meant for beginners, so if you're new to Tosca, I hope it's possible to understand all the examples. We will not concentrate on any advanced examples here. The know-how should therefore be based on our AS1 certification, the Automation Specialist 1, and should be kind of a prerequisite, so you should have at least a know-how after the certification. We cover the basics, more will come. We are working on creating more and more of those best practices. If you already want more of those for more advanced best practices and more details, I would recommend you to look out for our Test Architect 1 training, Level 1 training, that goes into those best practices in much more detail than I could show in the time today. Okay, enough talk about the why. Let's dive into the first best practice that is, in my opinion, one of the most important ones in Tosca, verification points. It is very important that you have at least one verification point for each and every test case that you create. Without a verification, you don't know if the system behaved the way you want it to behave. Of course, finding a control is a test in itself, but you always need to make sure that the test outcome that you expected from a certain scenario is verified, so you can make sure at this point where you have the verification that if it fails, you know why. This is also relevant for test data creation. Even if you only want to create test data for later test cases to use, you want to know in this test case that your test data was created correctly and it works for the following test cases. Otherwise, the outcome is not defined and you don't know what to expect in later stages or in the system under test. Let me give you a quick example. I used the demo webshop to quickly check if the logout functionality works. So as you can see here in this test case, first I'm logging into the application here. I register myself, so I have always a stable test prerequisite. And then here I click on the logout button, but there is no verification what happens after this logout button click. So if I don't do anything and the application just hangs and does not do a logout, I would not verify that later on the application really logged me out. So you could get a passed result out of this test case, even though the logout did not work. So if you add a verified test step, as I did here in the demo webshop, as soon as you log out, the login button appears again, so you can do a login. You verify that the logout really worked, and now the test outcome of your test case is really verified, and you can make sure that the logout in your system under test, or in this example, did work. Okay, I hope this makes sense to you. I think this is a very important best practice, and you should even check with queries or whatever to see how many test cases you have that do not have a single verification step. Okay, let's go to the next one. It's kind of an easy one and more intuitive one. The number of module attributes in your test case. So for readability and maintainability, every module should only hold a certain amount of attributes. So a simple rule of thumb we always train is that you should have as many module attributes as you have controls on the screen. But that does not always work, because if you have more than 15 or 20 controls on your screen, the module gets unreadable and not easy to maintain, and also not easy to use, right? Because if you want only to click on one link on the screen and you have a list of 30, 40 or more module attributes, you will always need to search what you want to do. So if you have many screen elements, then we recommend that you even split up one screen into multiple submodules based on the business area that you're working in. Let me give you a quick example. Here we have the main screen of our demo webshop that has a lot of links and link sections on it. Here we have categories, we have manufacturers, popular tags, and we have the newsletter here, and so on. So there's a lot of elements on this screen that would, as you can see here, have a really huge impact how many module attributes you have in this module. So if you want to verify if one or two links of those are okay, it's a long list to go through. So we would recommend you to split that up into multiple modules, where you capture certain sections of your screen, depending on the size of your application, of course. So a rule of thumb that I always use is that you should not have more than 15 or 20 module attributes in one module. Otherwise, it gets hard to read. In the example before, you can see that not even the end of the list was reached, and we still have more module attributes. It's hard to read, and it does not even fit on one screen. So if you split that up, you can even name the modules based on the sections. And with our find feature in Tosca, the fuzzy search that you hopefully already know, you can more easily find the sections that you want. So as kind of a naming convention, I always use then the main page and then separate the sections by a naming convention. For example, the categories here will get a categories tag here. The popular tags that you can see here left will name popular tags. So it should always be easy to read and easy to find. And for those of you who ask the question, why didn't we use control groups? In this example, we didn't use a control groups for one because it's an example. And for the other, we want to verify in this test case that I'm using here if the links are there and are correct. And this is in some ways much more easier than with control groups. Okay, let's go to the next best practice. It's something that I often see in test portfolios. I've worked with a lot of customers and I reviewed a lot of portfolios at customers. And one thing that I always have seen is that test cases tend to be not readable. So you cannot quickly see what a test case do. Which brings me to the next best practice. The module name is unchanged, meaning when you use a module in your test case, the name is taken as it was in the module section, which describes the screen or the screen element, but it does not describe what you do with this module. So here, test cases and their test steps should be always easy to read, and even easy to read for a business user or the one reviewing the test cases. Therefore, you should take the time and rename those test steps after you drag and drop the module onto your test case. A general convention that we're always using is that you use the action that you take in this test step and on which control or controls in the test step the action is taken. Let me again give you a quick example. Here, we directly use the modules as they are in the module section. You can even see there is duplicate names. We have main screen. It does not say what I'm doing on the main screen. It says products. It does not say what to do with products or what the next step is. Then we have again main screen, which with underscore, something that we hate when we're reviewing portfolios. And then we have a certain steps that we could find out what it is about, but I think it's very hard to read. So you would never be able to tell which of those test steps do a wait or an input or a verify operation, right? So we cleaned that up, and even with some folders, I will talk about folders later on, but each of those test steps has kind of an explanation what happens in this section. Select the book section, add computing and internet to shopping cart. And here you can see enter billing address, enter shipping address. So it's always the action that we're doing. And here in this test step, we also write buffer, order number, and verify. And in my opinion, this is much easier to read, even for someone not that familiar with Tosca, than the version before here, where you don't even know where the buffer and verification does happen, or what happens on two different main screens, for example. So I know it's easier if you're quickly creating a test case, or if you have hard deadlines, just to drag and drop the modules, or using the fuzzy search, quickly adding the modules to a test case, but you will have much more effort later on maintaining those test cases, reporting them, or even understand it weeks later what you did in your own test case, if you do not change the names of the test steps accordingly, and in my opinion also add some folders to separate the sections what you're doing. Here I separated those between the sections that I'm working in, right? So here it's the main screen where I add certain books to the shopping cart. Here I work in the shopping cart directly. And then this section here is all about the shipping, where I go through the different shipping sections, entering the different addresses and the payment and so on. And I think it always helps to separate those sections, but I will go into more detail later on that. Okay, I hope this was understandable. Let's go to the next most wanted, in my opinion, regarding mistakes people are making when they're creating automated test cases, the so-called static waits. So static waits is something that's very easy to do. You just use the TC wait module in your test case, put in a time that you want to wait, and you can, if the application has certain loading times, you can easily wait for 5 seconds so the application is loaded. But this approach is very unstable. So you should use static waits, or the so-called TC wait module, only if it's absolutely necessary. You should use the wait on function instead. If you have a static wait of 5 seconds and your application one time takes 4 seconds and one time takes 10 seconds, then in one time with the 4 seconds you wait too long, which prolongs the execution time of your test cases. This might not make a difference for one test case, but for 1,000 test cases, each and every second counts if you want to execute them in a nightly run, right? And if the application takes 10 seconds instead of those 5 seconds, then the test case fails again, even though you built this TC wait to wait for your application. And this is why we have the feature of the wait on action mode, where you can wait on until a certain control has a certain state. So in this example here, you can see I have a hard-coded wait in there. So it will wait 1 second, even though the application, most of the instances will be faster. And if the application for some reason is slower, the test case will fail. And I will need to validate that in my nightly execution why the test case again failed, and I will need to re-execute it. With a wait on certain elements here, you can see that it waits as long as a certain state is not reached. In this case, we're checking if this shopping cart notification is visible, and only then it will go on and verify a certain text, or in this case, if the control really is visible. So just one note on the side, I would recommend, even though you have the wait on and it is kind of an implicit verification if the control is there, for reporting and test purpose, I would still recommend using the verify here. But the important part right now is that the wait on is set and that we're waiting for the application as long as it needed, and not for a specific amount of time that could fail or prolong my test case. You can use it in combination. For some, in some instances, it might make sense that you want to wait a certain amount of time because you know it always takes 20 seconds until the application is loaded, and then there is kind of a plus minus depending on the day the system is in, and the load, that how many users are on the system or whatever. But the important part is that if you're using a static wait, please always combine it with a wait on after the static wait, so you can make sure even if it takes a little bit longer, the test case still can run through. And one thing that I also want to point out, because some people tend to use loops when the wait times are very long with wait on commands, which again is too much effort in my opinion and not stable enough. So you should try to tweak those synchronization timeout times that are shown here, and set them higher if needed, so you can prevent using those loops with multiple wait ons. For example, here the wait on is set to 10,000 milliseconds, which means 10 seconds. If your application needs 15 seconds, then of course the normal timeout will appear. And the wait on period is 20 seconds. So if you need 25 seconds, even the wait on would fail. And because the wait on here with this setting waits a maximum of 20 seconds. So some people create a loop for that and loop through the application until the application is there. But I would recommend using the timeout feature here and increase it to a minute or something, so that the wait on alone works and you're waiting the amount of time the application needs. Okay, let's go on to the next best practice. This is something about unattended execution, continuous integration, and stability of your test cases, which is the send keys and the click functionality in braces. So those are just two examples of ways to use direct keyboard or mouse operations to steer your application. And you should only use those if absolutely necessary. Tosca supports, for example, for web automation, that direct events are fired, click events and stuff like that, so that keyboards and mouse operations are not necessarily needed. So you should only use them when necessary, because it takes longer to move the mouse or to send input than to directly run the click method or click event of a certain functionality, which will be much faster and much more stable. Here are some examples. You can see here the cart button, add to cart, is clicked by using the click method or click command, which is a mouse functionality, right? The mouse needs to go there and needs to directly click on it. So instead of that, you should always use X, which is executing the event, which is not possible on all controls, I know. And there is, for example, some people using the span control for doing some input operations. And if the input is not supported, like click X, then you need to use the click instead. You should prevent it as often as possible, and you could even think about a customization for certain controls that you often need to make it possible to directly click on it with events, because it will increase your performance a lot. Okay, here's another send keys example. In this case, in an edit box, there are send keys used. Even though it's not necessary in this case, I often see in portfolios that people don't know that you can directly write smartphone into the value instead of sending send keys there. And using send keys will always be much more unstable than just directly putting the smartphone text into this control. The same goes below here. Instead of sending the enter send key here, you could simply click on such elements. Instead of that, you can see here it even reduces complexity. This is the same test case, just using direct control steerings. And if you compare those two, you can directly see it's much more easier to read. Sorry, wrong direction. Much more easy to read this test case, and it will also be much more stable. Okay, let's go to the next one, loops. This is a thing that I have often seen, that instead of doing different test cases, people loop through tables and creating very complicated loops with if statements and counters. But this is not the way Tosca should be used. Loops should only be used if absolutely necessary. And if you need to iterate through something, then you should use the repetition feature. I will show that in a moment. Loops is always like coming from programming. People that created scripts for automation are used to them, but this is not the way that Tosca should be used. There's better ways of handling Tosca, especially when it comes to tables, where people tend to loop through instead of using our constraint functionality. As you can see here, we have a product table in the demo web shop, and here this is one example of such a loop. There is a counter set at the beginning. There is always calculated the counter +1. There's a condition checked if the row count is smaller as our counter, as the row number, sorry, and then there is an expression evaluation that checks if the row number is smaller than the counter. And then here it picks the table and verifies if the name is health, and if the condition here, which is an if statement, is health, then it clicks on it, and otherwise it waits for 3 seconds. Otherwise, if we find the right element, the counter is reset, so the loop is finished. So this looks more like programming and is even hard to read for me, although I created it. As you can see, I made a mistake at the end. So this is not easily maintainable. And when you execute the automation, it will be much longer than our preferred way of doing things. And this is something that for some people using Tosca for a long time may sound ridiculous, but I've seen this in almost every project when people try to start with Tosca and find out that we have loops and if conditions in Tosca. The right way of doing it is simply using our constraint feature here to constrain a certain product, right? That's called health in this case, and then just click in the same row on the remove button. So this will be not only is it easier to read, much easier to read, it will be much faster. Here you have a comparison between those two ways of doing things. On the left side you have the loop thing, and on the right side you have the version with the constraint. And I think it speaks for itself that the preferred way of doing things is with the constraint and not by looping through a table and find anything here. Okay. If an iteration is needed, and there are some rare instances where it is needed, then you should not use loops with a condition and as I just have shown you. You should use the repetition feature that you can see. There's a specific folder for that here on the left side where you can see the iteration sign. And this is just looping through something where the counter is automatically in the background increased one time. So it's very easy to use this repetition feature, and makes sense if you want to iterate through a table, for example, to click the right button to go to the next page for the table or something like this. So for tables, you can use the constraint, but if you want to loop through something where you need multiple clicks, switching pages on a table or something like this, then this repetition feature is the way to go. If you need more details on the feature itself, here is the link, or you can quickly search for repetition in our manual. Then you will see more details about how to create such repetition folders and how to use them. Okay, let's go to the next, number 7. One of my favorites is if usage. It's close to the loop usage and close to the fact that many people at the beginning try to use Tosca as a programming tool or a scripting tool, which it isn't. Tosca creates test cases on a very sophisticated level automatically for you in terms of how you can scan the controls and how you can use constraints on tables and stuff like that. So there's only rare instances where if statements, where you need to decide in which direction you want to go, are really useful or even needed. So in general, if statements should only be used in preparation sections of your test case or cleanup sections. The test case content, where you really do the steps that your application needs for a certain test or that you go through your system on a test, in those sections you should not have any if statements. If you have, and you will see this in the next example, I created one quick test case with some if statements in there. It's already hard to read because you have many different situations that you don't know when you get there in, right? So you don't know when you will hit this if statement because it has a condition already up there. Then you have again a condition, then you don't know, do you go into the then or else statement, and so on. So it's already unclear which outcome this test case has for which input, right? We have a condition on A and B. So you need to make sure if you execute this test case, which input you provide for this test case. Is it A or is it B? And then it will go a completely different way. So here you can see the flow diagram, the control flow diagram for this test case already. And I only used 3 or 4 if statements. And you can already see it looks highly complicated. And now if you execute your test case and mostly by random chance you get A as an input, then it will go this way here, right? If it's the other input, then you go the other section. But how would you know if you execute the test case one time which way it went through and if the behavior of this way is the expected one? There even could be a bug that if you input B, that it goes the other way around. Sorry, wrong direction in my slide deck. So there could even be a bug that if you input B, that it still goes the way of A, something like this here, and not the direction B, and the test case would still pass. So if statements breaks the general law of test cases that for a defined input, there must always be a certain output and not different directions it can go through. It not only increases your maintenance if you're using if statement, it also very much increases the way you can read test cases and your test case outcome. So if you even have one test case in your test case, you already have 2 different possibilities this test case could pass or fail, and you will never know which one. Okay, sometimes people then execute the test case 2 times and first preparing the application in a way that always one of the scenarios is hit, but that's much too much effort and it's error prone. So this is not the way we want test cases. Each test case should only have one defined goal, and then if it runs through and anything is different than before, then the test case should fail. So therefore, we have the test case design to create different variations of a test case very quickly, different input values and also different verification values. But each of those test cases has a defined path. It's different variations and therefore different test cases. So as you can see here, the happy path here has a specific set of data. And here our product 2 has just different input data and will behave a little bit differently but it's a different test case. And if you execute product 2, it will always behave as product 2, and there will be no different ways to go through the application. So in the blue section, this will receive in different test cases, no if statements in there, and you can execute all 4 of them. All 4 of them are pretty similar. It's the same process, but they're just going different ways in the same different ways in the application and taking slight detours in our process. But they're all from the same template, so they're easy to maintain, and there's no need for any if statements. So there's rare instances where if statements make sense. For example, in recovery scenarios is something that we recommend you to use to make sure test cases that fail create a certain stable scenario for your next test case. So if you run 10 test cases and the second one fails, we want the other one to be able to run through. And in those recovery scenarios, or in this case, a cleanup scenario inside those recovery scenarios, we want to make sure that if the user is logged in, that we log him out, so that the next test case can start with a stable login and does not have in the Internet Explorer have already a user that is logged in. So this is one scenario where an if statement makes sense, because in our recovery scenarios, we do not care if the test focus is met or if our system on a test is tested. What is important is that we clean up and that our application is in a state that we want it to be at the next test case. So this is one of the rare instances where if statements could make sense. It depends, of course, on the use case, but I would not recommend them using them in the direct test case content, as I've already said. If you have pre-processing or prerequisite steps in your application, starting the application, for example, then you can also use if statements to check if the application is already started, and if the application is not started. This would also be a rare instance where it makes sense to have it. As I said, only in preparation steps or in cleanup or post-requisite steps, not in the content itself. Okay, I hope this made sense, because using if statements is one of the main reasons repositories or portfolios are getting unmaintainable very quickly, and they should just not be used. Use the test case design or Excel as an input data source for your test cases instead of using if statements, because it will just not make sense, and you have only one test case where it should be 2 or more. Okay, number 8, top-level test steps. I just glanced at it a little bit in the previous best practices, and it's a very easy one, and I think a very intuitive one. The test cases you create should be all about readability and maintainability. And if you have a certain amount of test steps on top level of your test case, then it can be hard to read. So if you have more than, let's say, 10 test steps, it could be different for different scenarios. You should use top level folders to separate your sections between a prerequisite where you do the preparation, set buffers where you initialize your buffers for the application or reset them, where you start your system on the test, and where you load your test data, for example, from our test data management or the TDS, the new test data management service. Then you should have a folder for the content, which is the real content of your test case, where you test your system on a test and navigate through the application. And there should be a post-requisite folder, which is kind of the cleanup stage, and where you can close the system on the test and write back to the test data management the results of your test, the new state, and so on. So here's an example of a test case that only has 15 steps, that is already relatively hard to read and to see where is the prerequisite part of the application, where is the post-requisite part where you want to close and clean up and where is the real test content. And therefore, we would recommend to separate those into folders, because the folders alone, as you can see here, is already easy to read, and you don't need to read through all the test steps to see in which section you are. And you can see here we have this prerequisite folder that is all about open the application, register, and login. Then we have the content here, where we do the real test. We add the books to our shopping cart, and we remove certain books from our shopping cart, whatever. And then we have a post-requisite section for the cleanup. And if you expand those sections, it's still the same test steps, but it's much easier to read and separate it into certain sections. And one thing is very important: when you have those sections and folders, it's much easier to create reusable test step blocks out of it that you can later reuse in different test cases. I will quickly show you this feature live in Tosca. So here you can see I have Tosca, and I have a certain test case. Scroll there. Let's go here. Sorry, I already prepared it here. So here you can see there's a test case that I have a prerequisite folder, content, and post-requisite. And especially the prerequisite will be something that you will need often, right? You need to open the application and register. So for different applications, you will have the same prerequisite. So with an easy click here on this button here, create reusable test step block parameters, it will automatically create a reusable test step block for those steps, fill it with the reusable test step blocks parameters that you used in your application, and you have a reusable test step block automatically created with all the data that you need. So without those folders, it's still possible, but it's just much harder to do so and to create those folders out of specific section that you want to reuse. Okay, I hope that helped. Number 9 is image-based recognition. If your application is not out of the box easily steerable, it sometimes is very easy to use image-based recognition for automation. But in general and on a big picture scale, we would not recommend to use it, which I think is obvious. It's not that stable. It's not that not easy to maintain compared to direct control finding and event-based steering and so on. The readability is not that easy because you have different control types and so on. And for unattended execution, if you have a locked screen, the controls will not be rendered by Windows, those pictures, and then it could be an issue automating them. So this is why you should use any UI engine or image-based recognition only in rare instances, for example, to do certain preparation work that would be a high effort to customize or to automate, but not as a general a way of automating your test cases. Tosca gives you much more and advanced features for automation. So last but not least, number 10, unique test case name, which may seem unnecessary or even obvious, whatever. But I have seen in many reviews that test cases are not named according to what they really do and what kind of variation out of a big set of test cases one singular test case is. So it's very important, especially in larger environments or when you're growing, that each of those test cases have a unique name. So in your complete portfolio, or if you're using component folders to separate different projects, you always need to make sure that the test case in there is unique, and that if you report them in a simple list or something, you could read by the name of the test case what the test case does and what it is for. Otherwise, for example, here you can see nobody will know what those 3 test cases do. It may even be very useful what they're doing, we just don't know because the name does not say a thing. And it may seem ridiculous, but I have seen this in a lot of portfolios that nobody cared about naming those, and they execute them on a daily basis, and they work, but you never know what those test cases are about. So you should always name them based on what they're doing and in which application they're doing, or whatever is the best practice for your project. The important part is that this name is unique. In some projects, I've seen that there are certain numerical conventions where a set of numbers specifies in which application, which process, and which sub-process, and which data variation they are, and so on. So anything that works for your project, but it must be something that everyone in the project can read, especially business users that did not create the test case. So it must be easy to understand for the project members, and it must be unique. Okay, those were my top 10 best practices for today regarding automation and test case creation. I hope you could take something out of it, and we will update you regarding other best practices. And again, want to iterate that we already created the test architect training level 1 that has much more of those best practices and much more detail. Again, we only have 1 hour today, so the training is multiple days. So there is much more to come and much more available for you. As a last input, I just want to point out that it's important not to follow those best practices blindly. You should take out of it what you can and tweak them a little bit based on your project's needs, but you should not ignore them. You can improve them, you can change them a little bit, but we have long years of experience behind that, so it makes sense to use them if you want to have a maintainable portfolio. But again, for each project, it's a little bit different, so tweak them, but don't ignore them. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Let's move on to answer some questions. I already have a couple of them from the viewers with me for you. First of all, I try to use wait on, but it always stamps out. Is there another way to wait for the control without using static wait or changing the settings?
Okay, yeah, it's a good question actually. So there is possibilities that you on each module you could use a wait before or a wait after, because there are certain situations where each screen you need to wait, right? A static wait is something you need to add to each test case in each test step where you need it, or the wait on also is something that you need to add manually for each test step where you need it. But with those wait before and wait after on module level, you can decide to wait for a certain control always a certain amount of time or a certain state of this control. For example, with the wait before feature, you can wait on a certain state that a control is in before the steering starts on those controls.
If I have defined one recovery in my test case, one in my test case folder, and one in the folder above, which one will be run during execution? Or do they all run in a queue?
So it would running as long as all of them are failing. So it goes up in the hierarchy and picks the first one and tries this recovery scenario. And if this recovery scenario does not work or fix the application, then the next one would run. Yeah, that's it basically.
Okay, and I have another question, the last one here. Is it better to use if or TCD? What are the benefits of using TCD?
Okay, so again, I talked about if usage and why you should not use if statements, and you should use the test case design instead. So if you have one process that has different sub variations out of it, different input variations, or different steps that you need to take in the application, although it essentially is the same process, then you should use the test case design to, on a high level, on an abstract level, define those different variations out of your test case. And this is the red section, the test case design, and the blue section in Tosca always defines the steps that you need to take for a certain variation out of that. So instead of hard copying certain test cases, which would lead in a maintenance issue, right? If you copy one test case and you then need later on to change it because your application changed, you need to change 2 test cases instead of 1. And the usage of test case design and the so-called templates that will be specified in more detail in our AS2 training, you can make sure that you have one template that you need to maintain. So it's a kind of a singular test case. And then you can create multiple variations out of it based on the content in the test case design, or even Excel would be supported. And if something changes in the application, you only need to change the template, and then the test case variations out of it would be automatically updated, which is a huge maintenance benefit. And also it's easier in terms of test case design to see which variations you already have, because it's much easier to read and more compressed and abstract the data that you see there than all the steps that you need in one test case template.
Wow, thank you for your answers, and thank you for the MOOC today.
Thanks. I hope it helped.
Before we end the session, I would like to remind you of our upcoming MOOC, which will cover managing test data with the new test data service. The session will be on April the 25th, 2018. As always, we will have 2 sessions to cover different time zones. Also, we would kindly ask you to please complete the feedback at the end of the session. If you have any further question or inquiry not covered in this MOOC, please contact our support or training department, as well as the knowledge base at support.tricentis.com. We can also be reached on social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.